Hello and welcome here at the end of 2025 to the annual Best Books of the Year video. A word of warning right here at the beginning. This video is going to contain mostly shout outs and honorable mentions because, as I've said repeatedly, 2025 has been a hellishly bad reading year for me, maybe the worst reading year I've ever had. And of course, I could still rank all my books and talk about the 10, 15, or even 20 books that were least bad, but that's not really the spirit we are looking for here, is it? So I will keep my love and my big feelings for just 5 books at the end of the video, and these 5 books will be ranked from least best to best, and the other 12 to 14 books in this video will just be honorable mentions. Let's start with a handful of rereads. I reread far fewer and different books in 2025 than I had originally planned, but much to my relief, the rereads that I did of favorite books or books that I had loved on the first read, they all held up on the second read, and I enjoyed my rereads very much. These 4 books, they are all very short, almost novella sized, or half of them are novellas and the other ones very short novels. They are all, and they all have a folk tale element to them, and most of them also a mystery element and also a romance element, but they are none of them, except maybe for the last one, straight up romances. The romance is just one aspect in a more complex story. And they are Silver in the Wood, a Green Man's Story by Emily Tesh, Stray Fears by Gregory Ashe, which is paranormal mystery slash folk horror set on the outskirts of New Orleans. And then 2 books by Arden Powell, The Fairy Hounds of York, which I would also classify as folk horror, but the horror elements in this are, well, it's more eerie and somewhat spooky than slasher horror, which Stray Fears very much is slasher horror, plus also spooky and eerie. And the other one by Arden Powell, this is the one that is most straight up romance. The Solstice Cabin is set in the Canadian province of Nunavut, so in the far north of Canada, and it is a magical winter wonderland. There is probably, to tie it in with the rest of the rereads, there might be a very slight cosmic horror element in it if you squint, but mostly it is a cozy winter fantasy. It is set before and on the day of the winter solstice, obviously, but can be enjoyed all winter long, I think. Okay, now the first of my shout outs for new to me books that I read in 2025, and it is Rhine Journey by Anne Schlee. This is kind of a room with a view on the Rhine, minus half the romance, I guess. The Victorian English woman goes on a cruise down the River Rhine and finds herself. It is from the 1980s, or from 1980 precisely, I think. It is Victorian in setting and in style, but not in terms of how the interiority of the characters is treated. It is not a big literary event, and to be perfectly honest, most of its appeal to me was nostalgic in nature, because I'm from near the River Rhine and I've been to all the places that are described here in this book numerous times, and I have loved lots of them dearly. So reading this felt a little bit like coming home. And I also always feel at home with an Asterix comic. This is the latest Asterix comic, Asterix in Lusitania. And I think, to be honest, it is one of the more forgettable volumes. However, it made me laugh so hard. There isn't much of a plot to this one, it's all vibes, but the vibes were very, very funny this time. And then a German book by an Austrian author, Die Verwirrungen des Zöglings Törles, The Confusions of Young Törles by Robert Musil. This is about the growing pains of the title character Törles in a boarding school slash military academy. And it is about how his personality forms, which is as yet unstable and is always torn between different poles. There are the authorities on the one hand, and then on the other hand, his own ideas and desires, which are at the moment changing quite drastically and not always consistently. And then there are his peers, which on the one hand inform his growing personality, but are also often in opposition to it. And this is about how he positions himself and how his identity develops under these circumstances. It gets a shout out mostly for how it 100% is informed by and feeds off and showcases scientific, psychoanalytical, pedagogical ideas, new ideas of its time. The early 1900s is when this was published. But at the same time, it makes these ideas its own. It doesn't just regurgitate them and isn't all too on the nose with them. In this way, it is radically different from a book that I mentioned in my worst reads of the year video, which also puts psychological, psychoanalytical notions to good use, but does so in a very uninspired, very straightforward, and cringingly obvious way. And Robert Musil does so in a much more deft manner. Then we have my Nabokov read of the year, Despair. This is an early work of Nabokov's that he later in life translated into English and reworked pretty substantially in the process. It gets a shout out for being an early instance of a character with traits that we will love to hate and love to laugh about in Nabokov's later and greater novels. Pale Fire, Pnin, Lolita, and Despair, the main characters of all these novels, will make you head desk in amused despair. I wouldn't recommend starting with this book though if you haven't read Nabokov before, but I'd recommend starting with one of those three that I just named. E.M. Forster gets a shout out for being, as always, far, far ahead of his time, and in this case also eerily prescient, in this short story called The Machine Stops, which is a science fiction short story set in the far future, or actually not so very far future perhaps, in which humanity has gotten itself into a state of tech dependency that seems, on the one hand, almost ludicrously exaggerated, and yet, on the other hand, eerily plausible and disquietingly probable almost. And my last shout out goes to Jen Lyons's epic fantasy series, A Chorus of Dragons, of which I read the last two books, the last two of five books this year. They are book four, The House of Always, and book five, The Discord of Gods. This series had its ups and downs, but mostly ups, really. Um, I enjoyed the first book and the third book most. The first book is The Ruin of Kings, and it is a wild ride. The third book is when things start to become a little bit more clear and you actually understand what's going on. So, in that regard, the third book was the most enjoyable one for me to read. But the first book is already prime entertainment. What sets this series apart is mostly how it is told, because story wise, it is a pretty classic chosen one story and fellowship slash motley crew kind of story where people come together to prevent the end of the world, literally. But Jen Lyons plays a lot with perspective, with who is telling the story, which are the same characters yet different in each book, and the way the story is told makes it feel much more complex than it really is. One thing, though, about how the story is told was almost a turn off for me, and I think might be quite a problem for a lot of fantasy readers. It is that the writing style is quite colloquial, and it almost sounds like 2010s, 2020s internet speak sometimes, with, lots of micro paragraphs of the kind of, except it wasn't, or yeah, that didn't work. It's not really the kind of language that you expect to read and, let's be honest, prefer to read most of the time in an epic fantasy series. But the number of instances that this happened it wasn't exactly low, but it made it still tolerable. It was just this side of annoying. And in the end, the good things and the originality cancelled out the bad things for me. I had a great time reading this series, and I will definitely reread it at some point because there is so much that you don't understand, especially about the first book or the first two books, really, on the first read. So I'm looking forward to finding even more to enjoy in the series in the future. Okay, now we have arrived finally at my five favorite reads of the year. And this time, for a change, two of them are nonfiction books. Coming in at number five, The Magic Flute, Opera and Mysteries by Egyptologist and cultural studies scholar extraordinaire Jan Assmann. This is about the ideas and the view of ancient mystery cults and their integration, adaptation, and further development in the Freemasonry tradition up until Mozart's times. And most of all, of course, how that is reflected in Mozart's opera, The Magic Flute. This book felt like coming home to me. I am a historian of ancient history, and although I'm not an Egyptologist, much of my research, and in fact my PhD dissertation, was about ancient Greek Egypt. And so a lot of what Jan Assmann points out in here felt immediately obvious to me. Not much persuasion needed on his part to convince me that he was right in his interpretation of the magic flute. There was a lot still to learn for me in here, especially about the Freemasonry landscape of Mozart's time, but it also felt, like I said, like coming home, like a comfort read. I think this book would be of interest to anyone with an interest in either the history of opera specifically or classical music just in general. At number 4, we have this novella by the freshly baked Nobel laureate Laszlo Krasznahorkai, and it is called A Mountain to the North, A Lake to the South, Path to the West, A River to the East. In this story, the grandson of Prince Genji, displaced in time, is on an eternal search for a perfect garden inside a temple enclosure, which he has only ever spotted in an illustrated book of gardens before. This story is about how we search for meaning, but also how we make meaning in a world that is always decaying, and how we are trying to combat or escape the decay, but also about how we are not exactly masters of that particular art. This is a very short novella, but I think it is incredibly rich and can be reread over and over again because it is so circular, and also because everything in it references some other aspects in it at some other place in the story, going forward and going backward. Like I said, everything is circular, and there is so much still to discover on the second, third, fourth reads, I expect. And reading it for the first time definitely already felt like you were looking at this precious little garden that is at the heart and center of it. Spot number 3 goes to Gregory Ashe in general, who is my favorite writer of gay mysteries. But in particular, it goes to his series, The First Quarto, which is a 4-book series. I actually started reading the series in 2024 or even 2023 because I think the first book is either free or just 99 cents. The first book is called Yet a Stranger. And I thought it was all right. I wasn't bored. There was nothing particularly to dislike in it, but I wasn't compelled to read more. The protagonists in this book are a college freshman, so he is going through college in the course of this 4-book series, and an older grad student who is 10 years his senior, and in the first book is actually even his tutor, and their relationship develops in the course of this 4-book series as well. They are sleuth stories, so neither of the protagonists is an undercover cop or even a private investigator. They are just private citizens who get into these impossible situations in what is essentially the crime capital of the world, the organized crime capital of the world in Gregory Ashe's universe, but it's really just a fictitious small town in, was it Missouri? Oh no, I forget, somewhere in the Midwest. Missouri is Midwest, isn't it? Anyhow, I got back into this series and picked up the second book in the series, The Fairest Show. And what this series really took a turn for me with the second book. And I ended up caring so much about this relationship and also about the stories. There is a monster of the week aspect to each book, but there's also a big overarching story arc. And Gregory Ashe is so good at writing both the mysteries and the romances. And his characters and relationships always feel so raw and believable and realistic, even when he writes characters who are over the top quirky, which the two in this series are not. If you are looking into getting into Gregory Ashe, I would recommend this series, the first Quarto with Yet a Stranger as the first book, or The Lamb and the Lion with the same breath as the first book. In spot number 2, got you again with the thumbnail. You thought it was going to be my best book, didn't you? But no, Eugene Onegin is only my second favorite read of the year. And to be more precise, Stanley Mitchell's translation and his version of Eugene Onegin, because of course I didn't read Eugene Onegin, or I didn't read Yevgeny Onegin. I read Eugene Onegin. I read the English version, and of course every translation is an interpretation. I thought, from what I could tell, Stanley Mitchell did an incredibly good job. At least it felt incredibly smooth to read. I hope this is the same in the Russian original. Otherwise, of course, it wouldn't be a good translation. So I've been familiar with the story of Eugene Onegin for a long time from watching the opera and the ballet, which the ballet I think is based more on the opera than on the original work. And I was so happy and relieved to discover that in the original text, Eugene Onegin is much less of a jerk and much more of a tragic character than in the opera and especially in the ballet. I felt so much sympathy for Tatiana as I would have expected, but also really for him, with the notable exception of the Lenski episode. If you know, you know. He really isn't a jerk at all, and I felt as much for him reading this than I did for Tatiana. But most of all, I have to admit, I enjoyed Pushkin's witty remarks about people and the culture of his time. All the sticky notes or tabs that you see here are witty remarks that I found relatable and or funny. Especially, I was especially entertained by the beef that Pushkin seems to have had with English romantic poets and writers. This was an unexpectedly gripping and entertaining read for me, and I can see myself rereading this, or at least passages from it, again and again in the future. But my favorite book of the year is still the book that was my favorite at the end of the first quarter. It is Meteorite by Tim Gregory. In this book, Tim Gregory weaves history of science and the science of the history of our universe together into one hell of an entertaining read of a pop science book. I have never come across an explanation of the formation of our solar system that is, on the one hand, as easy to understand and to follow, and at the same time, on the other hand, as satisfyingly complex as Tim Gregory's is in this book. Tim Gregory is clearly passionate about this subject and about his discipline of astrophysics, and he is great at breaking down complex issues and processes step by step to make them understandable to the layperson. But yet, on the other hand, he doesn't insult the reader's intelligence. He takes the reader seriously. He is a great storyteller, and his passion is catching, and he's made the world seem a little bit more magical to me. He's also had a real impact on my life, because I took my cue from him, and over the Easter weekend, or on Easter Saturday to be more precise, I finally took it upon me to travel by train for 2.5 hours to finally visit the Bavarian town of Nördlingen, which sits almost smack in the middle of an ancient meteorite crater. And if you climb the highest church tower in the old city of Nördlingen, you get a great view, a great 360-degree view of the rim of the meteorite crater. Lots of the buildings in the old town of Nördlingen are also made from local stone from a nearby quarry, which, due to the incredibly high pressure from the meteorite impact, is full of microscopically small diamonds. So Nördlingen is kind of Germany's diamond town, if you like. It is overall a super cute town and is well worth a day trip. So, as you can see, I had a great time in my life because of this book, and it is by far the best, most enjoyable book that I read in 2025. And that's it for 2025. It can only get better.